This morning we are very blessed to have Mr. Eddie Chumney, the world traveler, with us once again. No, don't clap for him. He's a Cleveland Brown guy. And Eddie and I have this ongoing chatter going about the Cleveland Browns versus the New York Giants. I'm a New York Giants fan. Even though I haven't watched any football this season, I said I wasn't going to watch any football because of their stance. Anyway, but you still are a diehard Cleveland.
Only when they win, which is like once in 20 years.
That means you're not a real fan if you're not for them even in the lean times.
No, I'm fair weathered.
Well, would you please give a warm welcome to Eddie Chumney, please?
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Well, I left Ohio at the beginning of the month and came here for the first day or so of Feast of Tabernacles. I left here and spent the rest of the Feast of Tabernacles in Chandler, Oklahoma. And I left that Feast of Tabernacles and went to another Feast of Tabernacles that's doing another calendar in Lawton, Oklahoma. Then I went to visit a friend and actually had an afternoon Bible study in Wichita Falls, Texas. And then I went to Amarillo, Texas and spoke at a congregation. What was that? Was that last weekend? And then from there, went to Western Kansas because they found out when I was in Amarillo that I was there. And so they invited me to come to Western Kansas. So I spoke there for a couple of days. And then in the last year, somebody who's contacted the ministry and basically found out about me by the divine hand of God. Stopped in Kansas City for a couple of days, and now I'm back here. So I'm making a big circle. And then from here, I finally get to go home. So when I was in Kansas City the last few days, I went over a timeline from now to the start of the Great Tribulation. So since I just did that the last 2 days, I thought that that would be a good topic to share here today because it's fresh in my mind, and I don't think I've ever taught this in this way. When I teach about the end of days, I touch on different things, but I don't think I've ever taught on it in this day. So in order to give you some biblical perspective before I start from now to the time of the Great Tribulation, this is the board we have to work with. And so if you guys can't see it, either you can listen or you can come over here where you can see it a little bit better. But basically, there's a very important biblical principle, and that is biblical history is prophecy. So therefore, those things that happened in the Garden of Eden with Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, with northern kingdom, southern kingdom, they are prophecies, actually. You're not just reading history. So in the very big picture of understanding time, we have from Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, given that Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, then man and the earth faced the consequence of that sin, and they were to labor and toil. And the amount of time that they were to labor and toil is 6 days, or 6,000 years. So each day in creation, 7 days of creation, each day in creation represents 1,000 years of time. And so scripture reference to that perspective is Psalm chapter 90, verse 4. Psalm chapter 90, verse 4, 1 day equals 1,000 years. So Psalm 90, verse 4, and that is quoted in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. So for those of you who like to take notes and like to see the scriptures, we'll take the time to read those two verses. Psalm chapter 90, verse 4, "For 1,000 years in your sight is but yesterday when it is past, and as a watch in the night." And then 2 Peter in chapter 3 and verse 8 reads, "But beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day." So Yeshua came at his first coming after 4 days. After 4 days. So we've been 2 days, or 2,000 years since. Now, the biblical term for this period of time, 1 to 6,000 years, it's called the present age. The present age. So there's a reference to asking about this period of time in Matthew in chapter 24 and in verse 3. The King James reads, "And when he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, what shall these things be? What will be the sign of your coming?" And the King James reads, "the end of the world." Well, it makes it sound like the world's going to cease to exist. But it really properly should be rendered, when is the end of the age, not the end of the world, because the world's not going to end. What was being asked is, what's the sign that we're coming to the end of 6,000 years? So why was that the question? Because after 6,000 years, we have a 1,000-year period that's commonly called the millennium or the Messianic era. So remember biblical history's prophecy in creation? On the seventh day, the Creator, who is Yeshua, John chapter 1, verse 3 and verse 10, Colossians chapter 1, verse 16 says that He created the heavens and the earth. In other words, He's the one that said, "Let there be light." So it was the will of the Father to create the world, but Yeshua is the one that said, "Let there be light." And so Yeshua rested on the seventh day of creation. So each day in creation is 1,000 years, so that's prophetic, that the seventh day that He rested in creation is a prophecy of a day of 1,000 years when man and the earth is going to rest. Because the creation was created to keep Shabbat. So time is laid out in a prophetic week. 7,000 years. 6,000 years of work, toil, from Adam's sin in the Garden of Eden. 1,000 years, the earth rests as well. So to make the connection, the Sabbath is called the day of the Lord. And we can understand that from Isaiah chapter 58, verse 13. The Sabbath is called the day of the Lord. So I'll turn to Isaiah chapter 58 and verse 13. "If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord honorable." So the Sabbath is called my holy day. The Sabbath is called the holy of the Lord. So the Sabbath is the day of the Lord. So the Sabbath itself is called the day of the Lord. And don't know if you ever thought about it this way or not, but we live and we repeat things every 7 days. Every 7 days we start over. And so this 7-day cycle by which our calendars are, this 7-day cycle, when you're living this 7-day cycle, you're prophesying. You're prophesying of the creation. You're prophesying of time that's laid out in the creation. So the Sabbath itself is called the day of the Lord. So the prophetic Sabbath of creation, I call it the prophetic Sabbath of creation, meaning the seventh day of creation is prophetic of a 1,000-year period. So the Sabbath is called the day of the Lord. So the prophetic Sabbath, which would be over here, the last 1,000 years, the Messianic era, the millennium, this is the prophetic Sabbath of creation. So the Sabbath is called the day of the Lord. So what's the prophetic Sabbath called? Same thing. It's called the day of the Lord. So here, this 1,000-year period is called the day of the Lord. Now, since the Sabbath is called the day of the Lord, who is the Lord that it's referring to? Because it says it's his day. Well, it's Yeshua. And let's see if I can find... Mark chapter 2 and verses 27 and 28. Mark chapter 2, verses 27 and 28. He said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And so the day of the Lord is the day of Yeshua. In other words, this is when he sets up his kingdom on the earth, and he rules and reigns on the earth, and he does it for 1,000 years. And what is he going to be doing primarily during this Messianic age, this 1,000 years? Well, what do you do when you're coming here on the Sabbath? You're coming to learn the Bible, to study the Torah. I see on this schedule here, you gotta, you're going over the Torah portion here as a part of the gathering. And so we see this, that the Lord of the Sabbath, on the Sabbath, the prophetic Sabbath, is going to be teaching the Torah. Isaiah chapter 2 and verses 2 and 3. Isaiah 2, I'm going to continue to verse 4. Isaiah 2, 2 to 4. And it will come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountain. And it shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations will flow into it. Many people will go and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways. We will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the Torah and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So when is Isaiah 2:3 talking about? Next verse. He will judge among the nations. He will rebuke many peoples. They will beat their swords and their plowshares, their spears and their pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn of war any more. So this is, Isaiah 2:4 is what's regarded as the peace of the Messianic era. And what's he going to be doing? He's going to be teaching the Torah to all nations. I don't know if you ever thought about that, given that Isaiah 2:3 says that the Torah is going to be taught to all nations from Jerusalem, because it's in Jerusalem is where Yeshua is going to have his throne. And so actually what he's going to be doing is what he's given us a commission to do, but we've done in part, but we've in the fullness, we failed. That is the Great Commission. And see, I don't know if you've ever I don't know if you've ever gone back and really looked at the Great Commission, because we've kind of rephrased the Great Commission. We kind of rephrased it, go into all the world and preach the gospel. And we've kind of left it there, and then we've defined the gospel as just to tell people that Yeshua is the Messiah. It's very important that we tell people that Yeshua is the Messiah. And so in that regard, it's right, it's good. But here's what it says in Matthew chapter 28 and verses 19 and 20. Go therefore and teach all nations. Go and teach all nations. Verse 20, teaching them to observe all things that I've commanded you, and I'm with you always, even unto the end of the age. So the Great Commission is to teach all nations, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And so what are the things that Yeshua taught his disciples that he said is supposed to be taught to all nations? Did Yeshua teach his disciples to eat pig? Did Yeshua teach his disciples to celebrate Christmas and Easter? Did Yeshua teach his disciples about Sunday instead of Sabbath? And so we just said go and preach the gospel, but we've left out teaching all nations whatever I've taught you. And so Yeshua is going to fulfill his own commission. When he sets up his kingdom, he's going to be teaching the Torah to all nations. And so another important thing to understand in our timeline is a very important question would be, since we have not been on the exact same calendar since Adam and Eve. So we really don't know how many years it's been since Adam and Eve. But anybody that ever does a Bible study on chronology will come to the same conclusion, is that it falls in this generation. And we can't identify what year it falls in this generation, but anyone that does a Bible chronology study always comes that it falls in this generation. So, in chronology studies that I've seen, maybe 20 years ago, the range was like 1994. And then the ones that's been done here recently in the last 10 years by some people, the farthest they go that I've seen it is 2028 to 2033. So, there's a range there of 35 years, which is within a generation. And so that's why we don't know exactly when we are coming to the end of 6,000 years. So if we can't look on a calendar and ascertain that, absolutely. How we got to know when we get to the end of the present age, and how we got to know when we are going to start the day of the Lord? Well, the Bible tells us events and things that's going to happen when the day of the Lord is about to start, and then when the day of the Lord starts. It tells us events. So it's pretty simple. All we got to do is, when those events happen in our real world, that's how we know. If they haven't happened yet, then we're not there yet. It's that simple. And so what's not in the minds of Christians who study Bible prophecy, but it is absolutely in the minds of an Orthodox Jew every day, is the following thought. The end of the present age is synonymous, meaning it's one and the same, is synonymous with the end of the exile of Northern Kingdom and Southern Kingdom. It's synonymous. So the day of the Lord is going to start when Northern Kingdom and Southern Kingdom ends their exile, and ending the exile means returning to the land. It's synonymous with that. So as long as Northern Kingdom, Southern Kingdom is scattered in the nations, we still got time to go, and we haven't started the day of the Lord. So that is the big picture of understanding time, and I want to take from where we are now, and here's how I understand time. First of all, for those of you who may have come from a Sunday Protestant church background, and that's what I grew up in, and the Lord put upon my heart when I was 16 years old in Sunday school. I know the exact place where I was. I know the exact moment it happened. That was how clear and how strong it was. He put upon my heart, so that was over 40 years ago, to study Bible prophecy because he put upon my heart that I would live to see his second coming. So when I had that strong thought in Sunday school class when I was 16, I knew nothing, zero, about Bible prophecy. So, of course, you have to begin the process to study somehow. And so what was available to me 40 years ago was what is a timeline that mostly everybody that goes to Sunday Protestant church in America that is trying to study the Bible, I'm going to hardly meet anybody that doesn't have this in their mindset, which is what I was originally taught. And here's how time is mapped out. Now, this is what I'm mapping out. I know I was taught, I once believed, but now I no longer believe it, okay? And time is age of law, age of grace. And they call age of grace the church age. And then in this age of law, age of grace, and the age of grace is the church age, then they say the church is the bride, and all the church, or as they say, all the bride, because they're saved, their reward for being saved and believing in Messiah is going to go up in a pre-trib rapture. And then they say after the pre-trib rapture is a 7-year tribulation period, and at the end of the 7-year tribulation period is now going to be your 1,000-year millennium. That is the timeline that if you run into Christians who are going to a church that's trying to follow the Bible and teach the Bible, they're going to have that understanding of time. Now, right now, after studying for 40 years, like I said, after initially believing and being taught that, I now, from where I'm at now, I kind of view this as the Greek understanding, the Greek view. Because this view of explaining time does not factor in the Sabbath. It does not factor in the biblical festivals. And I've come to learn that a reason why the Sabbath and the biblical festivals are given is it's supposed to teach us about time, and it's supposed to teach us about the first and second coming of the Messiah. So once I learned how the Sabbath and the biblical festivals, in the themes of the Sabbath, the themes of the biblical festivals, once I learned the themes and learned how they applied to the first and second coming of the Messiah, only then could I see the difference and the distinction between this normal time chart and this one up here that I've started to lay out for you, which that there's 7,000 years of time based upon time is a weekly Sabbath, a Sabbath of time. Each day is 1,000 years. This is what I'm going to call a Hebraic view. Okay, so I've given you now the big picture, 7,000 years, and the present age is synonymous. It ends with the end of the exile of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, a side point about that, which I don't think I think most people here have an understanding of, at least in some form or fashion, given that the traditional church views the tribes of Israel as all being Jewish. And as long as you view that they're all Jewish, you're going to think that the end of the exile is only about them. Only about them. And a lot of Christians, that's from this age of law, age of grace perspective, that's how they've been taught to see things, because the name they most often use for themselves is a Christian, and the names they most often use for them are Jews, and we don't use the biblical term house of Jacob. And at Mount Sinai, the house of Jacob was at Mount Sinai in Exodus 19. It says in Luke chapter 1, Yeshua is going to rule over the house of Jacob forever. And our relationship with Yeshua in the new covenant is we're adopted, we're grafted in. We're adopted and we're grafted in. And what we don't think through is when we are adopted or grafted in, we are now a part of the covenant. That means the promises that are associated with that covenant now pertains to us. And who did he enter in that covenant with? The house of Jacob, which individually is spoken of in Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 33, and Hebrews 8:8, as the house of Israel, northern kingdom, and the house of Judah, southern kingdom. So now this understanding that the present age is associated and synonymous with the end of the exile of the 12 tribes of Israel, we have to get in our mind and in our understanding that that is a prophecy about us through grafting, through covenant. And you don't need to know, and it really doesn't matter if you're physically descended from the 12 tribes or whether you're not. You are a part of the house of Jacob family through adoption. And through adoption, you inherit the promises of the covenant. So when I talk about the 12 tribes of Israel, I am not necessarily, and you should not only put in your mind the literal physical descendants, because we're talking about covenant, adopted in, grafted in. I inherit the promises that were made to the house of Jacob, and one of those promises is that that after being scattered in the nations, they're going to return to their own land. All right, with that being the case, I want to now focus in on this generation. And when Yeshua was asked in Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, learn a parable of the fig tree. He was asked in Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, what will be the sign of your coming of the end of the age? Part of how he answered the question was learn a parable of the fig tree. That is in Matthew chapter 24, verse 32. Learn a parable of the fig tree. And then he says, when you see these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Now, this learn a parable of the fig tree, that is Matthew chapter 24, in the section of how this is laid out in my Bible, it's verses 32 to 35, that there's a parallel to that in Luke 21. There's a parallel to that in Luke chapter 21. Luke chapter 21, and beginning in verse 29. He said, and he spoke to them, behold, the fig tree and all the trees. It says, when they now shoot forth, you see and know of your own selves that summer is near. Well, this is true about the literal fig tree and its figs that it makes. And so you can understand what he's saying if you know the growth cycle of a fig tree, but there's a deeper meaning here in that, and you will only know it if you know the Hebrew, that the Hebrew word for summer and the Hebrew word for end, the Hebrew word for end is kates. I believe the Hebrew word for summer is kutz. It's the same letters. So in the Hebrew, there is a direct relationship between end, as in the end of the age, and summer. And so, as often is the case in Hebrew, this is a play on the Hebrew. But, and speaking about learn a parable of the fig tree, in Luke chapter 21, verse 28, it says, when you see all these things, look up, for your redemption draweth nigh. Your redemption draweth nigh. So, most Christians don't know the Hebraic understanding of what Yeshua is referring to when he says, your redemption draweth nigh. You ask an Orthodox Jew, what does your redemption draweth nigh mean? And they'll tell you in a half of a second. It means the end of the exile. It's the end of the exile. It's the redemption. So remember I told you that the end of the present age is synonymous with the end of the exile? So when they ask Yeshua, what's the sign of your coming of the end of the age? He says, look for all this because your redemption, the end of the exile, draws nigh, and the end of the exile is the end of the present age, and the end of the exile is the start of the day of the Lord. And so now you're looking for signs of the end of the exile, which is the end of the present age. And so the next thing I want to map out for you, because we've got, praise Yah, very good attendance here, and I get to do part 2, so that means I don't have to be in a big rush now, and I can go a little bit slower. At least to me it's slower. People tell me all the time, even on this trip, listening to you is like drinking water out of a fire hydrant. So you know what laughing means? It means it's true, you know. So now, biblical history is prophecy. And so I'm going to use that principle to hone in on understanding the time of this present generation. I'm going to use the principle. So, historically, the house of Judah, the southern kingdom, they were taken into Babylonian captivity. And in Jeremiah chapter 25, it says that they were to go into that Babylonian captivity for 70 years. And so I'm sure most of you are familiar with that, but you may not have the chapter and verse memorized. So for the sake of the chapter and verse, we'll go to Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 9 and verse 11. It says, I will send and take all the families of the north, says the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land and against the inhabitants thereof. And verse 11, and the whole land will be a desolation and astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Now, I'm going to, based upon that, and use the principle that biblical history is prophecy, we're now got to go to Jeremiah chapter 29. Jeremiah chapter 29. And I'm going to focus on verses 10 to 14. Jeremiah 29, verses 10 to 14. So verse 10 says, thus says the Lord, that after 70 years be accomplished at Babylon. And then it says, I will visit you. So this is a code word in the Bible. The Bible is actually written in code. And if you know the code, you can decode it. But if you don't know the code, you won't have an idea what it's saying. So, I will visit you is a code for end of the exile. So what he's saying is after 70 years of Babylon, I'm going to end your exile into Babylon. I will visit you. And now I want you to pay attention to verses 12 and 13. And based upon the context of it's going to take place after 70 years. It says, verse 12, then you will call upon me, and you will go and pray to me, and I will hear you. I will hear you. And you will seek me, and you will search for me with all your heart, and I will be found of you. And so after 70 years, the Jewish people are going to seek for somebody with all their heart. Now, you know what causes you to seek for something or someone with all your heart? Is when you diligently want to find it and you don't know where it's at. And so who are they seeking for with all their heart, but they don't know who it is? But this prophesies who they're seeking for. He will be found of them. It's the Messiah. It's Yeshua. Well, historically, the Jewish people went into Babylonian captivity, we're told, in 586 BC. So, what is that? 2,600 years ago. 2,600 years ago, and they still don't know that Yeshua is the Messiah. And while they pray for the Messiah, they haven't fervently sought for him. They hope he comes. They pray that he comes every day, but they haven't fervently sought him as a people, as a nation, with all their heart. Because he says, when you do it, I will be found of you. So, if you understand that that's what that verse is speaking of, and it hasn't happened yet, well, 2,600 years is still after 70. So it's true. But biblical history is prophecy, and I believe this is talking about the last generation. That in the last generation, the Jewish people are going to go into another Babylonian captivity. But it's not literal. I mean, first that which is natural, literal, afterward that which is spiritual, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. So it was literal first, but then it's spiritual. So I'm going to show you how, I believe, that the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, have gone into a Babylonian captivity in your lifetime, in my lifetime. And it came about with the founding of the state of Israel. And the background of the founding of the current state of Israel is following World War II, the United States and Britain, the Allies, defeated the Germans and their allies. And the area of the Middle East was given to the Allies. And the area of what's called Israel today, but after World War I was called Palestine, was given to the British in what's called the British Mandate. So they tried to be friends with the Jews and the Arabs. It didn't work. And so after 30 years, they got frustrated and gave up and decided to give the problem over to the United Nations. So the United Nations General Assembly voted on the solution on November the 29th, 1947. I don't know about you, but they voted on it before I was born. November 29th, 1947, and they voted that there be a two-state solution. You ever heard of a two-state solution? And they also voted that Jerusalem would be an international city. You ever heard that Jerusalem needs to be a shared capital? It comes from this vote. And so, let me tell you the story behind what God had to do to make me aware of what happened on May the 14th, 1948, because I wasn't born at that time. So, I had made my first trip to Europe to speak and teach Hebrew roots in 2009. I was invited to go to Belgium, and on the way, I stopped in Ireland to share with the group. And while I was there in Ireland, the people who was hosting me said, "Oh, by the way, I have a grandma, and she just died here recently, and they was out cleaning out her house, and they was in the kitchen, and they lifted up the linoleum from the kitchen, and there was papers underneath the linoleum on the floor, and I wanted to show you and give you what was underneath the linoleum in the kitchen when we ripped it up." And here it was from it's called the Palestinian Post. Today it's called the Jerusalem Post. May the 14th, 1948, when Israel declared its independence. David Ben-Gurion declared its independence. So I read it, and in Israel declaring its independence, the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, said the following: "We're declaring the independence of the State of Israel because we are accepting the UN General Assembly vote of May the 29th, 1947. We're accepting it. And that two-state solution called for an Arab state and a Jewish state, and we're going to accept the Jewish state." So when they accepted this vote, they're actually accepting the authority of the ones who made the vote. And by accepting the authority of the ones who made the vote, they're making themselves a partnership with it or to it, and a partnership can be called a covenant. So the modern state of Israel was created by making a covenant with the UN General Assembly, meaning they agreed to their vote. Because actually Israel didn't become a member of the United Nations till 1960. So, but they made an agreement, and you can say they made a covenant with it. And that is why even today, if you look at the geography of the map of Israel, from the Mediterranean Sea and the closest point of the West Bank, there's only 9 miles. 9 miles at its closest point. And to divide Israel in two, you have to take those 9 miles. How would you like to defend the United States of America in 9 miles? Some of you come farther than that just to come here. Okay, so that is all what's between dividing Israel. And so it's indefensible borders, especially if you have an enemy. Indefensible borders. And so that's why it's not logical or practical, but yet why does the Western leaders, and up until Trump, from 1967 up until Trump, the presidents of the United States basically, it was good and okay with that there needed to be a two-state solution, is because they're trying to have the solution in the Middle East according to the United Nations, because the planners see that someday that there's going to be a one-world government. That's their hope, that's their plan, that's their desire. And one world government is going to be based upon international law. And so they want to start establishing and putting facts in order that we're making decisions between countries based upon international law. And they want Israel to be the example of that in making peace with her Arab neighbors. And so this vote of this two-state solution, Jerusalem being an international city, it was taken while the British still had legal authority over the area, and their authority over the area was called the British Mandate. And so it was decided that with this vote, they decided that on May the 14th, 1948, on May the 14th, 1948, is the day that was designated that the British mandate would end. And that's the day that they designated that this vote of the UN General Assembly would now be the entity that had the voice over the region. So today we don't see that the British mandate is still functional. And what the world leaders see that is functional for the area is this vote, this United Nations solution. So this is what I'm sharing with you in regard to is the modern prophecy, biblical history's prophecy, that Israel entered into Babylonian captivity by making this agreement. Okay, now according to the prophecy, how long are they going to be in this Babylonian captivity? For 70 years. Okay, so that captivity goes to May the 14th, 2018. That would be the end of the 70-year Babylonian captivity. Is there anything that happened on May the 14th, 2018 regarding this issue? That's when President Trump said that we're going to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So we have the United States, who's regarded as the head of the nations. Remember when Daniel saw the image of a man? What was the name of the head of gold? Babylon. So the United States is the head of nations, and so it could be seen as regarded as a Babylonian head. So the head of nations in our world, at least the Western world, is, and the leader is saying that I'm going to recognize Jerusalem as the capital, which if I take that straight forward, he didn't say, I'm recognizing Jerusalem as an international city. Okay, and then furthermore, something happened on December the 23rd, 2016. So this is when the Obama administration was leaving and Trump had not been inaugurated in January of 2016. And this is when we had, at that time, highly controversial UN resolution, UN Security Council resolution 2334. And this is the resolution that the United States abstained from. And I have on a blog that I haven't done basically since then, since 2017, watchmanofzion.com, I have what I regarded as some important details of what this UN resolution 2334 said. So I'm going to tell you what it said, and they're not keeping to the words of the resolution at this moment, at this day. But the resolution said, passed on December 23rd, 2016, which called for a two-state solution. It called for the sharing of Jerusalem. So it reaffirmed this UN resolution. It reaffirmed it, and then it said that the two-state solution would be completed and done in 1 year. So actually the resolution set an end date. 1 year. So 1 year would be December the 23rd, 2017. So it set this at the end date. So here we go, just 5 months later, after the set end date, Trump then calls for Jerusalem and recognizes it as the capital of Israel. And so, to me, this could be interpreted as a modern fulfillment of the 70-year captivity. And so, what does the prophecy say? After 70 years, they're going to cry to the Messiah. So, now we're going to begin the clock. It's only after May the 14th, 1948, is when it becomes possible to end the exile of the 12 tribes of Israel. Only after May the 14th, 2018, does it become possible for Israel to cry out for the Messiah and for him to hear their prayer. And here's what it also says he's going to do when he hears the prayer. In Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 14, it says, I will be found of you, says the Lord. I will turn away your captivity. I'm going to gather you from all the nations, from all the places where I've driven you. I will bring you again unto the place where I've caused you to be carried away from. So after 70 years, here's what's going to happen. They're going to cry out for the Messiah, and he's going to answer their prayer. And in answering the prayer, he said, I'm going to end your exile. Ending the exile is the end of the present age. He's going to hear their prayer. They're going to know that he's the Messiah after 70 years. So this just says it's going to happen. It doesn't say how it's going to happen. But if you look elsewhere in the Bible and do some cross-referencing, how is it going to happen? And I'm going to share that with you in part 2, because how it is going to happen is through the Gog-Magog war. So this is your background, and from this background, I'm going to take it from now, May the 14th, 2018. I'm going to take it from now, 2020, and give you a timeline to the start of the Great Tribulation, and we'll cover that in part 2. Okay? Is that a good background for you? All right. Praise Yah. Question. He's only got 1 minute and 57 seconds. And I take longer than that to answer a question. Biblical history is prophecy, yeah.
So, in the life of Joseph being reunited with his brother,
Yes.
how far down can we ratchet the details on that? Because he framed up Benjamin. He framed up Benjamin in order to test them. And it was then Judah, when Judah came back and took responsibility and was willing to give himself up, that's when the Messiah, or Joseph, revealed himself to his brothers.
Very good.
It also involved 2 sets of 7. It involved 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And I was wanting to know how literal we can bring all these parts of the parable down to our day.
Well, have you ever heard teachings that Moses is a type of Yeshua, and David's a type of Yeshua, and Solomon's a type of Yeshua? And we can make applications that they are types, but they're not types in everything about Moses' life. They're not types in everything about David's life. They're not types in everything about Solomon's life. So biblical history is prophecy, but you're not going to be able to take every single detail and apply it. You can't apply the general principle. All right?